I was enjoying my Saturday morning coffee when HOA President Karen demanded to inspect my backyard immediately. When I refused, she called 911 claiming I threatened her. What she didn't know. My wife Lisa was the dispatcher taking her call, and every word was a lie. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more HOA Karen stories. My name is Mike, and I never thought I'd become the neighborhood villain for simply wanting to enjoy my Saturday morning coffee in peace. But Karen Henderson, our HOA president, had other plans. What she didn't know was that her emergency call would land her in more trouble than she ever imagined. It was a beautiful Saturday morning in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I was sitting on my front porch, sipping coffee and reading the news on my tablet. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and everything felt perfect. My wife Lisa had left early for her shift as a 911 dispatcher, so I had the house to myself for a few hours. Our neighborhood was one of those cookie-cutter developments where every house looked almost identical. White picket fences, manicured lawns, and an HOA that made sure everyone followed the rules. Most of the time it was peaceful. Most of the time. I was enjoying the quiet when I saw her marching down the sidewalk like she owned the entire street. Karen Henderson, our HOA president, was a woman in her 50s with short blonde hair that never moved, even in strong wind. She always wore her badge of authority, a small pin that said HOA President, like it was a medal of honor. Karen had moved to our neighborhood about 2 years ago, and within 6 months she had somehow convinced enough people to vote her as HOA President. Since then she had made it her personal mission to control every aspect of our lives. She measured grass height with a ruler, checked mailbox positions with a measuring tape, and once fined a neighbor for having Christmas lights up on December 26th. I watched as Karen walked straight toward my house. Her face had that determined look she always wore when she was about to cause trouble. I took another sip of my coffee and prepared myself for whatever complaint she had today. "Mike," she called out while still walking up my driveway. "We need to talk." I stayed seated on my porch and nodded politely. "Good morning, Karen. What can I help you with?" She stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, hands on her hips. "I need to inspect your backyard immediately. Mrs. Johnson from 2 houses down called me this morning. She said she can see some kind of structure back there that wasn't approved by the HOA. I almost laughed. The structure she was talking about was a small wooden playhouse I had built for my daughter Emma last month. It was about 4 feet tall, painted bright yellow, and looked like something from a fairy tale. Emma loved it, and I had spent 3 weekends building it perfectly. "You mean Emma's playhouse?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I don't care what you call it," Karen snapped. "Any structure on HOA property needs approval before construction. You should have submitted plans, gotten approval, and paid the inspection fee. Since you didn't, I need to see it right now to determine if it needs to be removed." I felt my jaw tighten. "Karen, it's a small playhouse for my 6-year-old daughter. It's not even permanent. I can move it anytime." "That doesn't matter," she said, taking a step toward my porch. "Rules are rules, Mike. Now, I need access to your backyard for an official inspection." I set my coffee cup down and stood up. "I'm sorry, Karen, but you're not coming into my backyard without proper notice. According to our HOA agreement, you need to give 24 hours written notice before any inspection." Karen's face turned red. I could see the anger building in her eyes. "Don't quote HOA rules to me, Mike. I am the HOA. I don't need to give you notice for violations that are clearly visible." "The playhouse isn't visible from the street," I replied calmly. "Mrs. Johnson would have to be trespassing in my backyard to see it, which means she was probably snooping around where she doesn't belong." "How dare you!" Karen shouted. "Mrs. Johnson is a respected member of this community. She was simply looking out for all of us by reporting your violation." I crossed my arms. "Karen, I'm not letting you into my backyard today. If you want to inspect something, follow the proper procedures. Submit a written request, give me 24 hours notice, and schedule an appointment." Karen's mouth fell open like I had just slapped her. She wasn't used to people saying no to her. In the 2 years she had been HOA president, everyone either followed her orders immediately or moved away to escape her constant harassment. "You can't refuse me access," she stammered. "I have the authority to inspect any property in this neighborhood." "Actually, Karen, you don't," I said, pulling out my phone. "I've read our HOA agreement cover to cover. You have the right to inspect, but only with proper notice and only during reasonable hours. Showing up unannounced on a Saturday morning doesn't qualify." Karen stepped closer to my porch, her face now bright red with anger. "Mike, if you don't let me inspect your property right now, I'm going to fine you for every violation I can find." I'll make your life in this neighborhood miserable. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Are you threatening me, Karen? I'm warning you, she said, pointing her finger at me. I have the power to make things very difficult for you and your family. Don't test me. That was the moment I knew this woman had gone too far. Threatening my family was crossing a line I wouldn't allow anyone to cross. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Could you repeat that threat, Karen? I want to make sure I heard you correctly. She realized what I was doing and stepped back. Turn that phone off right now. This is my property, Karen. I have every right to record someone who's threatening my family. I wasn't threatening anyone, she protested, but her voice cracked as she said it. Really? Because I heard you say you'd make my life miserable and use your HOA position to punish me for not letting you break the rules. Karen's face went from red to purple. She was so angry she was shaking. You think you're so smart, don't you, Mike? Well, let me tell you something. I've dealt with troublemakers like you before. They don't last long in my neighborhood. I watched as Karen pulled out her phone with shaking hands. She was so angry she could barely hold it steady. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. If you won't cooperate, I'll call the police. We'll see how smart you feel when they arrest you for interfering with official HOA business. I almost laughed out loud. Karen, you want to call the police because I won't let you into my backyard without proper notice? You're obstructing official business, she declared. That's illegal. Karen, the HOA isn't a government organization. You're not a police officer. You have no legal authority to demand immediate access to anyone's property. But she wasn't listening anymore. She had already dialed 911 and was holding the phone to her ear. I continued recording, knowing this was about to get very interesting. Yes, hello. Karen said into the phone, her voice suddenly sweet and innocent. I need police assistance immediately. I'm at 412 Maple Street. The homeowner is being aggressive and threatening me while I'm trying to perform my official duties as HOA president. I shook my head in disbelief. She was completely lying about what had happened. He's being very hostile, Karen continued. I'm afraid for my safety. Please send someone right away. She hung up the phone and smiled at me with satisfaction. The police will be here in a few minutes, Mike. I hope you're ready to explain your behavior to them. I smiled back at her. Actually, Karen, I think you're the one who's going to need to do some explaining. What Karen didn't know was that my wife Lisa had been working as a 911 dispatcher for the past 5 years. She knew every officer in our district, and they all respected her judgment. More importantly, Lisa knew exactly what constituted a real emergency and what was just someone wasting police resources. I decided not to mention this to Karen. I wanted to see how far she would take her lies before reality caught up with her. You seem awfully confident for someone who's about to be arrested, Karen said, crossing her arms. I'm confident because I know I haven't broken any laws, I replied. But I'm curious, Karen. When the police ask you exactly what crime I committed, what are you going to tell them? She looked uncertain for the first time. You were threatening and aggressive. I was sitting on my porch drinking coffee, I said calmly. You came to my property, demanded access without proper notice, and then threatened my family when I refused. Everything is on video. Karen glanced at my phone, which was still recording. I could see doubt creeping into her eyes, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. The police will sort this out, she said stubbornly. About 10 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up in front of my house. Officer Martinez stepped out, a man I recognized from neighborhood barbecues and PTA meetings. His daughter went to school with Emma, and he and Lisa had worked together on several community safety presentations. Officer Martinez walked up my driveway with a professional but friendly demeanor. He nodded to me and then turned to Karen. Good morning, folks. I received a call about a disturbance. Can someone tell me what's going on? Karen immediately launched into her story. Officer, I'm Karen Henderson, president of this neighborhood's HOA. I came here this morning to perform an official inspection of this man's property, and he became hostile and threatening. He refused to cooperate with official business and made me fear for my safety. Officer Martinez wrote some notes and then looked at me. Sir, can you tell me your side of the story? Certainly, Officer Martinez, I said, and I saw Karen's eyes widen when I used his name. I was sitting on my porch this morning when Ms. Henderson came to my property demanding immediate access to inspect my backyard. When I explained that our HOA agreement requires 24 hours written notice for inspections, she became angry and threatened to use her position to make life miserable for my family. Do you have any proof of these threats? Officer Martinez asked. I held up my phone. I have video of the entire conversation including her threats and the phone call she made to 911. Karen's face went pale. He's lying, officer. He was aggressive and threatening from the moment I arrived. Officer Martinez looked between us thoughtfully. Ma'am, you said you were here on official HOA business. Do you have documentation for this inspection? Karen fumbled with her purse. I don't need documentation. I'm the president. I have the authority to inspect any property in this neighborhood. Actually, ma'am, HOA authority is governed by civil contract law, not criminal law. Even if this gentleman violated an HOA agreement, that would be a civil matter, not a criminal one. I could see Karen's confidence starting to crumble. But he was threatening and hostile, she insisted. Officer Martinez turned to me. Sir, may I see that video you mentioned? I handed Officer Martinez my phone and started the video from the beginning. Karen tried to protest, but he held up his hand for silence. We all watched as the entire confrontation played out on my phone screen. The video clearly showed me sitting calmly on my porch while Karen approached aggressively. It captured her demands for immediate access, her threats against my family, and her decision to call 911 when I refused to break the HOA rules for her. When the video ended, Officer Martinez handed my phone back with a serious expression. Ma'am, he said to Karen, I need to ask you some questions about this 911 call. Karen shifted nervously. What kind of questions? You told the dispatcher that Mr. Johnson was being aggressive and threatening, and that you feared for your safety. Based on this video, those statements appear to be false. I felt threatened, Karen stammered. Ma'am, filing a false police report is a serious offense. Using 911 services for non-emergency situations when you know it's not an emergency is also against the law. Karen's face went completely white. I didn't file a false report. I really felt like I was in danger. Officer Martinez looked at her skeptically. Ma'am, in the video Mr. Johnson is sitting calmly on his porch the entire time. He never raises his voice, never makes any threatening gestures and never approaches you. In fact, you're the one who came onto his property and made threats. I watched as Karen realized her plan had completely backfired. She had expected the police to arrest me or at least intimidate me into letting her do whatever she wanted. Instead, she was the one facing potential charges. Officer, Karen said desperately, surely you understand that I need to maintain order in this neighborhood. People can't just ignore HOA rules. Ma'am, as I explained, HOA disputes are civil matters. They don't involve the police unless someone commits an actual crime. Calling 911 and making false statements about threats and aggressive behavior is wasting police resources. Karen looked around frantically, like she was trying to find an escape route. This is ridiculous. I'm a respected member of this community. I volunteer at the school, I organize neighborhood events, Ma'am, Officer Martinez interrupted, your community involvement doesn't give you the right to misuse emergency services or make false statements to police. I decided it was time to reveal the connection that would make this even more interesting. Officer Martinez, I said, I think you should know that my wife Lisa is the dispatcher who took Karen's 911 call this morning. Karen's mouth fell open. Officer Martinez smiled slightly. Lisa Johnson is your wife? He asked. She's one of our best dispatchers. How much of this situation does she know about? She heard the entire 911 call, I replied. And she'll be very interested to know that Karen lied about the circumstances when she called for help. Officer Martinez pulled out his radio. Dispatch, this is Martinez. Is Lisa Johnson on duty this morning? Lisa's voice came through clearly. Good morning, Officer Martinez. Yes, I'm here. How can I help you? Lisa, I'm at your house dealing with a situation involving a false 911 call. Your husband has video evidence that contradicts what the caller reported. There was a pause before Lisa responded. Officer Martinez, I took that call about 30 minutes ago. The caller claimed there was an aggressive homeowner threatening her safety. Are you telling me that was a false report? Karen tried to interrupt, but Officer Martinez held up his hand for silence. Based on video evidence, it appears the caller misrepresented the situation significantly. The homeowner was calm and cooperative throughout the interaction. I see, Lisa said, and I could hear the professional concern in her voice. Officer Martinez, making false statements in a 911 call is a serious matter. It ties up emergency resources that might be needed for real emergencies. Karen looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. Lisa, I said into the radio, you should also know that Karen threatened to use her HOA position to make life miserable for our family when I wouldn't let her break the rules. Is that true, Officer Martinez? Lisa asked. It's clearly documented in the video, along with the false statements made during the 911 call. Officer Martinez looked at Karen seriously. Ma'am, I need to ask you directly, did you knowingly make false statements when you called 911 this morning? Karen was trapped and she knew it. I was upset. Maybe I exaggerated a little, but I really felt threatened. Ma'am, the video shows no threatening behavior from Mr. Johnson. In fact, it shows you approaching his property, making demands and threatening his family when he refused to comply with your requests. Officer Martinez continued, I'm also concerned about your statement that you have the authority to inspect any property in this neighborhood without notice. That's not accurate under HOA law, and it could constitute harassment if you're using that claim to intimidate residents. Karen finally realized how much trouble she was in. Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Maybe I should just go home and we can forget this whole thing. I'm afraid it's too late for that, ma'am. You've already made false statements to police, and we have clear evidence of those false statements. I need to complete my investigation. Officer Martinez turned to me. Mr. Johnson, do you want to press charges for harassment and false reporting? I looked at Karen, who was now clearly desperate. Part of me felt sorry for her, but I remembered her threats against my family. Officer Martinez, I want to do whatever is necessary to protect my family from future harassment. Word spread quickly through our neighborhood about Karen's false 911 call and her confrontation with me. By that afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from neighbors who had their own stories about Karen's harassment. Mrs. Peterson from 3 houses down called to tell me about the time Karen fined her for having dandelions in her yard, even though the HOA agreement specifically allowed natural wildflowers. Mr. Rodriguez shared his story about Karen demanding he remove a small garden gnome because it wasn't aesthetically consistent with the neighborhood, despite no such rule existing in our HOA documents. The most shocking call came from Mrs. Thompson, an elderly widow who lived at the end of our street. She told me that Karen had been threatening to fine her for not maintaining her lawn properly, even though Mrs. Thompson had explained she couldn't afford a lawn service and had difficulty doing the work herself due to arthritis. Mike, Mrs. Thompson said with tears in her voice, I've been so stressed about Karen's threats that I was thinking about selling my house. I can't afford the fine she keeps threatening, and I can't keep up with her demands. That conversation made me realize that Karen's behavior wasn't just about power trips or petty complaints. She was actually hurting people in our community, particularly those who were vulnerable or couldn't fight back. The next day, I decided to take action beyond just the police report. I pulled out our HOA agreement and read through it carefully, paying special attention to the sections about board member conduct and removal procedures. What I found was very interesting. According to our HOA bylaws, board members could be removed from office for conduct detrimental to the community or for abuse of authority. The bylaws also specified that any board member who used their position to harass or intimidate residents could face immediate removal. I started making copies of the video, documentation of Karen's false 911 call, and statements from neighbors about her harassment. Then I researched the legal requirements for calling a special HOA meeting to address board member conduct. It turned out that any resident could call for a special meeting if they had signatures from at least 25% of the homeowners in our neighborhood. We had 48 houses, which meant I needed 12 signatures. I started going door to door, explaining what had happened and asking neighbors if they wanted to address Karen's conduct officially. I was amazed by the response. Not only did people want to sign the petition, but many of them had their own stories of harassment and intimidation by Karen. Within 2 days, I had collected 28 signatures calling for a special HOA meeting to address Karen's conduct. But more importantly, I had documented evidence of a pattern of harassment and abuse of authority that went far beyond our single confrontation. Mr. Chin, who lived 2 streets over, provided copies of excessive fines Karen had levied against him for minor violations that weren't even mentioned in our HOA agreement. The Johnsons, no relation to me, had documentation showing Karen had threatened to put a lien on their house for painting their front door a shade of blue that was supposedly unauthorized, even though blue was specifically listed as an approved color in our guidelines. The most damaging evidence came from Mrs. Rodriguez, who worked part-time as a secretary for a law firm. She had researched HOA law and discovered that several of Karen's actions were actually illegal under state homeowner association regulations. Mike, Mrs. Rodriguez explained as we sat in her kitchen reviewing documents, Karen has been operating like she's some kind of dictator, but HOA presidents don't have unlimited power. There are specific procedures she has to follow, and she's been ignoring most of them. She showed me state regulations that required written notice for inspections, proper documentation for fines, and due process for any enforcement actions. Karen had been violating these requirements regularly. A week after the original incident, Officer Martinez called to update me on the investigation into Karen's false 911 call. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "I wanted to let you know that we're moving forward with charges against Ms. Henderson. She'll be charged with filing a false police report and misuse of emergency services." "What does that mean for her?" I asked. "She'll have to appear in court. If convicted, she could face fines and community service. More importantly, this will be on her record as a misdemeanor conviction." Officer Martinez continued, "I also want you to know that your wife Lisa has been very helpful in documenting the false statements made during the 911 call. Her professional testimony will be crucial if this goes to trial." Lisa had been following the case closely, both as my wife and as the dispatcher who took the original call. She was particularly upset that Karen had wasted emergency resources with her false report. "Mike," Lisa told me that evening, "in my 5 years as a dispatcher, I've seen how false reports can tie up officers and delay response to real emergencies. What Karen did wasn't just wrong, it was potentially dangerous." 2 weeks after our confrontation, we held the special HOA meeting to address Karen's conduct. The meeting was held at our neighborhood community center, and I was amazed by the turnout. Nearly every homeowner in our development was there, along with several people who had moved away specifically because of Karen's harassment. Karen arrived with her husband and what appeared to be a lawyer. She looked nervous but defiant, like she still believed she could talk her way out of the situation. I had prepared a detailed presentation documenting Karen's pattern of harassment, abuse of authority, and violation of HOA procedures. But I let other residents speak first, sharing their own experiences with Karen's conduct. Mrs. Thompson spoke about the stress and anxiety Karen's threats had caused her. Mr. Chin detailed the excessive fines he had been forced to pay for violations that didn't exist in our HOA agreement. The Petersons explained how Karen had made their teenage daughter cry by yelling at her for riding her bike on the sidewalk, even though there was no rule against it. Story after story painted a picture of a HOA president who had used her position to bully and intimidate residents rather than serve the community. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she stood up with her lawyer and attempted to defend her actions. "I want everyone to know that everything I've done has been for the good of this community," she began. "Property values in this neighborhood have increased 15% since I became HOA president, and that's because I've maintained standards." Her lawyer tried to argue that Karen had been acting within her authority as HOA president and that any mistakes were simply overzealous enforcement of community standards. But then I played the video of our confrontation and the room fell silent. Watching Karen threaten my family and then lie to police was damning evidence that couldn't be explained away. Several residents stood up to challenge Karen's claims about property values and community standards. Mrs. Rodriguez presented her research showing that Karen had violated state HOA regulations repeatedly. Mr. Peterson pointed out that the neighborhood had been well maintained and property values had been rising steadily for years before Karen became president. After 2 hours of testimony and discussion, it was time to vote on Karen's removal as HOA president. The vote required a simple majority of homeowners present at the meeting. The vote wasn't even close. 42 homeowners voted to remove Karen from office, with only 3 votes in her favor: Karen, her husband, and Mrs. Johnson, who had originally reported my playhouse. But the community didn't stop there. Several residents proposed additional measures to prevent future abuse of HOA authority. We voted to implement new rules requiring written documentation for all fines, mandatory 24-hour notice for inspections, and a resident complaint process for addressing board member misconduct. We also voted to refund all excessive fines that Karen had levied without proper authorization, which amounted to over $3,000 that would be returned to various residents. A month later, Karen's criminal case went to court. Lisa testified as the dispatcher who took the 911 call, explaining how Karen's statements during the call were contradicted by the video evidence of our actual interaction. Officer Martinez testified about the investigation and the clear evidence of false reporting. The video of our confrontation was played in court, showing Karen's aggressive behavior, threats against my family, and decision to call 911 when I refused to let her violate HOA procedures. Karen's lawyer tried to argue that she had genuinely felt threatened and that her 911 call was made in good faith. But the video evidence was too clear, and Karen's own words contradicted her claims of feeling threatened. The judge was particularly concerned about the misuse of emergency services. "Ms. Henderson," The judge said during sentencing, 911 services exist to protect people in genuine emergencies. When you make false statements to tie up these resources, you're potentially preventing officers from responding to real emergencies where people's safety is at risk. Karen was sentenced to 40 hours of community service, a $500 fine, and 6 months of probation. She was also required to complete a course on conflict resolution and community leadership. With Karen removed from the HOA board, our neighborhood held an election for a new president. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had done such excellent research on HOA law, was elected unanimously. She immediately implemented the new procedures we had voted on and began working to repair relationships within the community. The playhouse that started the whole controversy stayed exactly where it was. In fact, several other neighbors built similar structures for their children, and Mrs. Rodriguez made sure to update our HOA guidelines to specifically allow small, temporary play structures. Mrs. Thompson, who had been so stressed by Karen's threats, became much more active in neighborhood activities. She started a community garden project that brought residents together and beautified our common areas. Mr. Chin organized neighborhood barbecues that helped rebuild the sense of community that Karen's harassment had damaged. The most ironic part of the whole situation came 6 months later when Karen and her husband put their house up for sale. During the real estate process, potential buyers researched the neighborhood and found records of Karen's criminal conviction for filing a false police report. Several potential buyers were concerned about purchasing a home in a neighborhood where the former HOA president had been convicted of harassment and false reporting. The house sat on the market for 4 months before they finally had to reduce the price significantly to find a buyer. Karen's obsession with property values had ultimately hurt her own property value more than any violation she had ever complained about. Looking back on the whole experience, I learned several important lessons about standing up to bullies and protecting your community. First, documentation is crucial. The video I recorded of our confrontation was the key piece of evidence that exposed Karen's lies and protected me from her false accusations. Without that video, it would have been her word against mine. Second, bullies often rely on people being too intimidated or too busy to fight back. Karen had gotten away with her harassment for so long because most people just paid the fines or complied with her demands rather than challenge her authority. Third, communities are stronger when people work together. Once residents started sharing their experiences with Karen's harassment, we realized that her behavior was a pattern, not isolated incidents. By working together, we were able to remove her from power and implement better protections for everyone. A year later, our neighborhood is a much better place to live. Property values continue to rise, but now it's because we have a genuine sense of community rather than fear-based compliance with arbitrary rules. Mrs. Rodriguez has been an excellent HOA president, focusing on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement. She organized the community garden project, coordinated neighborhood social events, and worked with the city to improve our street lighting and sidewalks. The new HOA procedures we implemented have prevented any future abuse of authority. All fines must be documented with specific rule citations, residents have a clear appeals process, and board members can be easily removed if they engage in harassment or misconduct. Emma still plays in her yellow playhouse every afternoon after school. Sometimes neighbor children join her, and their laughter fills our backyard. It's exactly the kind of sound a family neighborhood should have. As for Karen, we heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to a condo complex with no HOA rules at all. Maybe she learned her lesson about the importance of treating people with respect rather than trying to control them through fear and intimidation. My confrontation with Karen Henderson taught me that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to stand your ground, document everything, and let their own actions expose their true character. Karen's decision to call 911 with false accusations backfired spectacularly when she didn't know my wife was the dispatcher who would expose her lies. But more importantly, this experience showed me the power of community action. When people work together to address problems, they can create positive change that benefits everyone. Our neighborhood is now a better place to live because residents stood up to harassment and implemented better systems to protect each other. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply letting bullies face the natural consequences of their own actions. Karen's need to control and intimidate others ultimately led to her losing all the power she had worked so hard to gain. Meanwhile, our community became stronger, more connected, and more protective of its most vulnerable members. The yellow playhouse still stands in our backyard, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance against unreasonable authority can lead to the biggest positive changes in a community.